The wind came from the northwest that September, carrying a cold that had no business arriving before the leaves turned. I'd spent enough seasons in these mountains to know the difference between weather and warning. This was warning. I was staying in a canvas tent then, the kind hunters use for a week or two before heading back to town. It leaked at the seams, and the stovepipe rattled when the wind found it. The tent had worked well enough through summer, but I'd felt the shift that morning, the way the air pressed down instead of moving through, the way the aspens held their leaves too still, like they were listening. My grandfather used to say that winter tells you it's coming if you know how to listen. Not the winter of calendars and dates, but the real winter, the one that arrives when it's ready and stays as long as it needs to. He'd lived through 83 of them before he passed, and he'd spent most of those winters in structures that people now called primitive. He never used that word. He just called them lodges. I walked the ridge line that afternoon looking east toward the valley where smoke from town made a gray smudge against the mountains. Up here the air was clean enough to taste metal in it. Cold has a flavor when it's serious, like iron and stone. I could feel it settling into the low places, pooling in the draws and hollows where it would sit all winter, waiting. The canvas tent snapped in a gust, and I made my decision. I'd come up here to learn what my grandfather had tried to teach me before he died, the things I'd been too young or too modern to pay attention to. I'd brought books about traditional skills, notebooks full of drawings and measurements, but I hadn't brought the one thing that mattered. I hadn't brought the willingness to trust that the old ways worked because they had to work, because people had died learning them and lived teaching them. I had 2 months before the snow would make gathering materials impossible. 2 months to build what my grandfather had built every autumn of his life, a teepee. Not the souvenir kind sold to tourists, but the real structure, the one designed by people who understood that survival wasn't about fighting the cold, but about living within it. That night I sat outside the canvas tent and watched the stars appear in a sky so clear it hurt to look at. The cold was coming, and it would be the kind of cold that finds every weakness in your shelter, every gap in your knowledge, every moment you chose comfort over competence. I could leave. I could pack up the tent and drive down to town before the roads became impassable. I could spend the winter somewhere warm, somewhere easy. But my grandfather's voice was in that wind, asking the question he'd asked me 100 times, "What are you willing to learn?" I stayed. The next morning I began walking the forest, looking at trees the way he'd taught me, not as lumber, but as partners in the work ahead. The teepee would need 13 poles, each one chosen for straightness, strength, and the particular job it would do in the frame. I carried his knife, the one with the worn handle that fit my hand, the same way it had fit his. The blade was sharp enough to split hair, sharp enough to read the grain of wood before cutting it. I found the first pole in a stand of lodgepole pine, growing so thick they'd competed their way into straightness. The tree I chose was about 6 inches at the base, 40 feet tall, and dead straight for the first 30 feet. I tested it by pushing against the trunk, feeling for rot or weakness. The tree pushed back, solid and sound. Before I cut, I did what my grandfather had done. I put my hand on the bark and said, "Thank you." Not to the tree, trees don't need gratitude, but to whatever it was that made trees grow straight in the first place, that made them strong enough to hold up a shelter, that made them available when people needed them. The old ones had words for this, prayers and ceremonies, but I didn't know them well enough to say them properly. So I just said thank you and meant it. The saw bit into the wood, and the tree came down with a sound like a sigh. I limbed it where it lay, cutting the branches flush to the trunk, then dragged it back to the clearing I'd chosen for the build. By the time I finished, my shoulders burned and my hands were sticky with sap. The pole lay in the grass like a promise. 12 more to go. I'd marked 7 potential sites before I found the right one. My grandfather had taught me that location was half the battle. Build in the wrong spot, and you'd spend all winter fighting problems that shouldn't exist. Build in the right spot, and the land itself became part of the shelter. The first site I considered was a flat bench halfway up the ridge, protected by a stand of spruce on the north side. It looked perfect until I dug into the soil and found clay 6 inches down. Clay doesn't drain. Water would pool under the teepee floor every time the snow melted, and moisture from below was harder to fight than cold from above. I marked it off the list. The second site offered good drainage, but the wind had carved a path through it that you could see in the shape of the trees, all of them leaning slightly east, all of them with bark worn smooth on the west side. A teepee could handle wind, but why choose a spot where the wind lived? The third, fourth, and fifth sites all failed for similar reasons: too exposed, too shaded, too far from water. The sixth was almost right, but when I stood in the center and looked east, the view was blocked by a rocky outcrop. The door had to face east. That wasn't tradition for tradition's sake. It was because the sunrise would warm the teepee's entrance in the morning, drawing out the cold air that had settled overnight, and because the prevailing storms came from the west, pushing against the back of the structure instead of trying to tear open the door. The seventh site was in a clearing ringed by old-growth fir on a slight rise that would shed water, but wasn't high enough to catch the worst of the wind. The soil was a mix of sand and loam, dark and rich, the kind that drained well but held heat. To the east, the clearing opened onto a meadow where I could watch the sun climb over the mountains. To the west, the fir trees stood close enough to break the wind, but not so close they'd drop widowmakers on the teepee in a storm. Tested the drainage by digging a hole 2 feet deep and filling it with water. By evening, the hole was dry. I spent that night in the clearing, watching how the wind moved through it, listening to the way the trees sounded when gusts came through. The wind circled the clearing, testing the edges, but the center stayed calm. In the morning, I knew I'd found it. I marked the center of the circle with a stake, then tied a length of rope to it, 9 feet long, the radius of the teepee I'd build. Walking the circumference with the rope pulled tight, I traced a circle in the earth with a stick, checking twice that the door would face true east. The circle had to be exact. A lopsided teepee would shed snow unevenly, creating pressure points where the poles could fail. My grandfather had used a particular phrase when he talked about placement. Listen to where the lodge wants to be. I'd thought it was poetry when I was younger, the kind of thing elders said to make simple tasks sound mystical. But standing in that clearing, I understood. The land had contours and character, patterns in the way water moved and wind blew and sun fell. You could force a teepee into the wrong spot, but it would fight you every day you lived in it. Or you could find the spot where the teepee fit the land like a key in a lock, and everything else became easier. I cleared the circle of rocks and roots, working carefully to keep the ground as level as possible. A teepee floor didn't need to be perfectly flat. Slight variations would help with drainage, but major unevenness would create gaps where cold air could creep in. I pulled stones that were too large, filled depressions with soil, and checked the level by eye, walking the circle a dozen times. By afternoon, I'd prepared the ground. The circle sat clean and ready, oriented to the cardinal directions the way my grandfather had oriented every lodge he'd built. The work was simple, but it had taken all day. That was the first lesson of traditional building. Nothing happened quickly. You didn't rush the preparation because preparation was the structure. Get it wrong here, and you'd pay for it every night you spent inside. I stood in the center and turned slowly, checking the sight lines, feeling the way the air moved, watching where the shadows fell. The clearing had a presence to it now, a sense of readiness. The stakes were driven. The circle was marked. The place had been chosen. Now came the hard part. 13 poles. The number wasn't arbitrary. It came from the geometry of the structure itself. 3 for the primary tripod, that would bear the load, 10 more to fill out the frame and create the cone shape that shed snow and caught the updraft that pulled smoke from the fire. 13 poles, each one different, each one selected for a specific role. I started cutting on a morning when the air was still and cold enough to see my breath. The first 3 poles had to be the longest and strongest. These would form the foundation tripod. I'd found them growing in a dense grove where competition for sunlight had pushed them straight up, no curves, no irregularities. Lodgepole pine, named by the people who'd used them for exactly this purpose for as long as anyone could remember. The cutting was the easy part. I felled each tree, limbed it, and dragged it back to the clearing. The hard part was the preparation, stripping the bark, trimming the taper, making sure each pole was straight, enough to stand true under load. My grandfather had taught me to sight down the length of each pole like a rifle barrel, checking for even the slightest bow or twist. A pole that looked straight lying down could reveal a curve when you stood it up, and by then it was too late to fix. I stripped the bark with a draw knife, pulling long curls of it away from the pale wood underneath. The bark came off clean, smelling sharp and fresh, leaving the poles smooth and slightly sticky with sap. I worked in the shade because my grandfather had said that poles dried in direct sun would check and split. I didn't know if that was true, but I trusted that he'd learned it the hard way, probably by watching a pole split under load in the middle of winter. Each pole had a thick end and a thin end. The thick end would rest on the ground, bearing the weight. The thin end would rise to the peak, forming the smoke hole. I measured them all to 30 feet, longer than necessary, but you could always trim. Length and the extra height would give me room to adjust the pitch of the cover later. The work took 3 days. 3 days of cutting, dragging, stripping, and stacking. My hands blistered, then calloused. My shoulders and back learned the weight of 30-foot poles dragged through timber and underbrush. By the time I had all 13 poles peeled and stacked, I understood something my grandfather had never said outright. The labor itself was part of the learning. You didn't just build a teepee, you earned it. Your body learned the weight of it, the balance of it, the particular resistance of wood that was alive a week ago and was now becoming structure. I let the poles season for 2 weeks, stacking them on logs to keep them off the ground, covering them with a tarp to protect them from rain, but letting air circulate around them. Green poles would work, but seasoned poles were better, lighter, stronger, less prone to warping. I spent those weeks gathering other materials, but every day I checked the poles, looking for cracks or checks, making sure they were drying evenly. When the 2 weeks were up, I carried the first 3 poles to the clearing and laid them out like spokes, their thick ends positioned around the circle I'd marked. These 3 would cross at the top, forming the tripod that everything else depended on. I'd practiced the lashing pattern on smaller sticks, wrapping and knotting the rope the way my grandfather had shown me. But this was different. These poles were heavy, awkward, and there was no room for error. I lashed the 3 together at a point about 4 feet from their thin ends, wrapping the rope in the pattern he'd taught me, around and through, pulling tight, but not so tight. The rope cut into the wood. When I'd wrapped it enough times that the joint felt solid, I tied it off with a knot that my grandfather had called the one that matters. I'd practiced that knot 100 times on scraps of rope, and now my fingers moved through it without thinking. The tripod lay on the ground, bound at the top, the 3 poles splayed out like the legs of a compass. I walked to the tied end and lifted. The poles were heavier than I'd expected, but they rose together, the lashing holding. I walked them upright, stepping backward, guiding the thick ends into position around the circle. When the tripod stood free, I adjusted each pole until the crossing point sat directly over the center stake. It stood. 30 feet of bound pine standing against the sky, the 3 poles leaning into each other at exactly the angle my grandfather had described, steep enough to shed snow, shallow enough to catch heat. I stepped back and sided up the length of each pole, checking that they hadn't twisted or bowed under their own weight. They stood true. I felt something then that I hadn't expected. Not pride, exactly. More like recognition. The tripod looked the way it was supposed to look, the way it had looked for hundreds of years before I was born. It looked inevitable, like it had always been standing there and I'd just uncovered it. The other 10 poles went up one at a time, each one laid into the fork where the tripod crossed, each one positioned to create the cone shape that would hold the cover. I worked my way around the circle, spacing them evenly, checking that each pole's angle matched the tripod. By the time I set the last one, the frame looked like a skeleton, complete but waiting. I walked around it, checking the spacing, adjusting poles that seemed too close or too far apart. The frame had a presence now, a shape that blocked the wind and cast a shadow. It wasn't a teepee yet, just bones, but it was starting to remember what it was supposed to be. The geometry of a teepee isn't intuitive. It looks simple, a circle of poles leaning inward to form a cone, but the actual mechanics of how it sheds snow, deflects wind, and creates an internal climate are built on principles that took generations to refine. I'd read about it in books, seen diagrams with angles and measurements, but none of that prepared me for the reality of standing inside the frame and understanding why every detail mattered. The door had to face east. I'd marked it already, but now I had to position the door poles, 2 straight poles that would frame the entrance and support the edges of the cover. These poles didn't lean as sharply as the others. They stood more upright, creating a flattened section in the circle that would become the door opening. I'd cut them slightly longer than the rest, so they'd extend past the peak, giving me something to tie the cover to. I set them in place and checked their alignment by eye, making sure they were parallel and symmetrical. A crooked door would mean a cover that didn't close properly, and a gap in the cover meant heat loss and smoke problems. I adjusted them twice before I was satisfied, then moved on to the pole layout. The traditional count was 13, but the exact number could vary depending on the size of the teepee and the materials available. What mattered was the spacing. Each pole had to be far enough from its neighbors that the cover could stretch tight between them, but not so far that the cover sagged. I walked the circle, checking the gaps with my hand, making small adjustments. Too wide here, too narrow there. The poles had to be evenly distributed, and the only way to check that was to trust your eye. My grandfather had told me that the teepee was a living structure. It moved in the wind, flexed under snow loads, breathed with the changing temperatures. If you built it too rigid, it would break. If you built it too loose, it would collapse. The right tension came from understanding that wood wanted to move, and your job was to guide that movement, not prevent it. I checked the pitch of the poles by standing at the center and looking up. They all converged at a point about 30 feet above the ground, creating a smoke hole roughly 18 inches across. That measurement was critical. Too large, and rain would pour in. Too small, and smoke wouldn't vent properly. 18 inches was what my grandfather had used, and he'd lived through winters cold enough to make the trees explode. The peak bundle, the point where all the poles crossed, had to be tight enough that the poles couldn't shift independently, but not so tight that they couldn't move as a unit. I climbed up a ladder I'd built from scrap wood and checked the lashing, tugging on each pole individually, feeling for play. There was some movement, but it felt controlled, like the whole frame was breathing together. From the top of the ladder, I could see the full circle of the floor layout. It was almost perfect, maybe an inch off in one section, but close enough. The door poles framed the entrance cleanly, pointing true east toward the meadow. The back poles, the ones that would bear the brunt of the western storms, were the thickest and strongest. The whole frame leaned at the angle my grandfather had described as steep enough to shed snow, shallow enough to hold heat. I climbed down and walked the perimeter again, checking that the thick ends of the poles were positioned exactly on the circle I'd marked. Small adjustments now would save problems later. I nudged one pole 6 inches to the left, pushed another back 2 inches. Checked the spacing with my hands, trusting the sense of rightness that came from having done this work under my grandfather's eye when I was younger, even though I hadn't understood it then. The frame was set. Tomorrow I'd add the cover, but tonight I wanted to sleep inside the bare frame, to feel how it interacted with the wind and cold. I'd read that the pole structure itself provided some shelter, not much, but enough that you could tell you were inside something rather than outside in open air. I built a small fire in the center, right where the permanent fire pit would go. The flames climbed straight up, found the smoke hole, and exited cleanly. Even without a cover, the cone of poles created a subtle updraft, pulling the smoke toward the peak. I watched it rise, white against the darkening sky, and felt the first real confirmation that this might actually work. The temperature dropped as the sun set. I sat by the fire and felt the cold air flowing down the inside of the pole frame, pooling at ground level before rolling out through the gaps. That was what the cover would stop, that flow of cold air. The teepee wasn't about creating a sealed box. It was about controlling how air moved, directing it in ways that kept you warm and the smoke vented. I wrapped myself in a blanket and listened to the wind test the frame. The poles creaked slightly, shifting against each other, but they didn't groan or crack. They sounded like a ship at anchor, moving but stable. I fell asleep watching the stars through the smoke hole, the fire burning down to coals beside me, and woke before dawn to frost on my blanket, but warmth still radiating from the stones I'd placed around the fire. The frame had held through the night. The poles stood exactly where I'd set them. The circle was true. Now I needed to give it a skin. Cedar bark came off in sheets if you knew how to harvest it. I'd spent a week finding the right trees, old cedars with thick, fibrous bark that hadn't been burned or damaged by disease. The technique was simple but specific. Cut a vertical line from ground to as high as you could reach, then a horizontal line at the top and bottom. Work a flat tool under one edge and peel the bark away in one continuous sheet, like removing the skin from an animal. The sheets were 8 feet long and 3 feet wide, rough on the outside, smooth on the inside. I'd collected 30 of them, laying them flat under weights to keep them from curling as they dried. Cedar bark shed water naturally. The oils in it made rain bead and run off, and it was light enough to handle, but tough enough to resist tearing. My grandfather had used hides in his youth, elk and buffalo sewn together in panels, but those resources were gone now. Cedar was what the coast people had always used, and it worked. I'd also collected canvas from an old tent I'd found abandoned at a trailhead, cut it into panels, and treated it with a mixture of beeswax and linseed oil to make it water-resistant. The combination would give me a cover that was traditional in function, if not in material. The cedar for the lower sections where moisture and abrasion were highest, the canvas for the upper sections where weight and rain shedding mattered more. The traditional pattern was a semicircle cut and sewn so that it would wrap around the cone of poles and meet at the front where the 2 door flaps would overlap. I'd made a pattern from paper first, measuring the circumference at the base and the height of the poles, adding extra material for the smoke flaps that would control ventilation. Sewing the panels together took 3 days. I worked with an awl and sinew, punching holes through the edges of the bark and canvas, then stitching them together with a running stitch that my grandfather had shown me. The sinew was deer tendon I'd prepared myself, soaked, stripped, dried into tough cordage that wouldn't rot or stretch. Each stitch had to be tight enough to create a seal, but not so tight it would tear through the material. The finished cover was a massive semicircle, 28 feet across at the base, curved to match the cone of the poles. I'd added 2 smoke flaps at the top, triangular extensions that could be adjusted with poles to control the draft and keep rain out of the smoke hole. I'd reinforced all the edges with extra stitching and had added grommets along the base where I could stake the cover to the ground. Raising the cover was a two-person job, but I was alone. I'd rigged a pulley system using rope and a high branch on one of the fir trees, but even with mechanical advantage, the weight was substantial. I dragged the folded cover to the base of the tippy frame and tied a rope to one edge. The plan was to hoist it up the back side of the frame, drape it over the peak, then work my way around pulling it into position. It took 4 hours. The cover caught on every branch, snagged on every rough spot on the poles, and twice I had to climb up and free it manually. But inch by inch, it rose. When it finally cleared the peak and draped down both sides, I secured the pulley rope and walked around the frame, checking the fit. The cover hung unevenly, bunched in some places, too tight in others. I adjusted it by pulling sections, redistributing the weight, making sure the door opening lined up with the door poles I'd set. The smoke hole at the peak had to stay open and centered, so I tied off the smoke flaps to their support poles and adjusted their angle to create a slight funnel that would catch updrafts. By evening, the cover was in place. It wasn't perfect. There were wrinkles and gaps that would need to be addressed, but it was recognizable now as a teepee. The cone shape stood complete, the cedar bark panels creating a mottled brown and gray surface that looked like it had grown out of the forest floor. I walked around the outside, checking the drape, pulling the base tight to the ground, and staking it with wooden pegs driven through the grommets. The cover had to be taut enough to shed water, but not so tight it would tear in high wind. I drove stakes every 3 feet around the circumference, adjusting the tension as I went. Inside, the transformation was immediate. The space felt contained, sheltered, darker than the open frame had been. The poles disappeared into shadow above me, and the smoke hole appeared as a circle of sky at the peak. The air inside was still, cut off from the wind that had been moving through the clearing all day. I built a fire in the center and watched how the smoke behaved. It rose straight for the first 6 feet, then began to spread out as it hit the cooler air near the peak. Some of it found the smoke hole immediately. Some of it curled back down along the inside of the cover before rising again. I adjusted the smoke flaps, changing the angle, and watched the smoke pattern change. Open the east flap, and the smoke rose faster. Close it, and the smoke pooled before venting. This was the fine-tuning that books couldn't teach, the subtle adjustments that controlled the internal climate. Too much draft, and the fire would burn too hot, wasting wood. Not enough draft, and smoke would fill the space. The balance point was narrow, and it changed with wind direction, temperature, and humidity. I spent the night making adjustments, watching how each change affected the smoke and heat distribution. By morning, I'd found a configuration that worked. Both smoke flaps slightly open, angled to catch the prevailing wind. The fire positioned slightly off-center to create a better draw. The cover was up, the smoke vented, the wind couldn't get in. For the first time since I'd decided to build, I was inside a structure that felt like it might actually keep me alive through winter. But it wasn't finished yet. The fire pit wasn't just a hole in the ground, it was the heart of the entire system, the source of heat, the driver of air circulation, the reason the teepee worked at all. Get it wrong, and nothing else mattered. I started by digging at the exact center of the floor, checking the position by stretching strings from opposite sides of the circle. The pit needed to be 2 feet across and 1 foot deep, large enough to hold a fire that would heat the space, small enough that the heat would rise instead of spreading out at ground level. The soil came out in chunks, dark and heavy, with root fibers. I shaped the pit with care, angling the sides slightly inward to create a bowl that would contain coals but allow air to flow underneath. My grandfather had said that fire breathes from below. You had to give it a path for air to enter, or it would suffocate. I lined the pit with stones, selecting each one for size and stability. River stones were dangerous. They could explode when heated. Because of trapped moisture, I used granite and basalt from the ridge, stones that had been exposed to sun and rain for decades, dry all the way through. I set them in a circle around the perimeter of the pit, then added a layer on the bottom, creating a thermal mass that would absorb heat during the day and radiate it at night. The stones had to fit tightly together, no gaps where coals could fall through and ignite the soil beneath. I worked each stone into place, adding smaller stones to fill the cracks, building up the edges until the pit was clearly defined. When I finished, I had a stone-lined bowl 18 inches deep, 2 feet across, sitting in the exact center of the teepee floor. I tested the draft by building a small fire with kindling and dry grass. The flames caught quickly and smoke rose in a thin column, climbing toward the smoke hole without spreading out. Good. The pit was positioned correctly. I added larger wood and watched how the fire behaved. The flames leaned slightly toward the door, pulled by the fresh air entering through the gap at the base of the cover. That was the intake. Cold air flowing in at ground level, warming as it crossed the fire, rising as it heated. I adjusted the smoke flaps again, fine-tuning the draw. The goal was to create a gentle circulation, cold air in through the door, across the fire, up and out through the smoke hole. Too much draft, and the fire would consume wood too quickly. Not enough, and smoke would accumulate. I let the fire burn for an hour, watching the smoke patterns, feeling how the heat distributed through the space. The stones around the pit began to warm, storing heat that would radiate long after the flames died down. The cover interior turned golden in the firelight, and the shadows of the poles stretched up the walls like spokes. The temperature inside began to rise. I could feel it most clearly at chest height, a band of warm air that hadn't been there before. Below that, the air was cooler, pulled down by the intake draft. Above it, near the peak, the air was warmest but thinner, rising toward the smoke hole. The teepee was creating layers of air, stratified by temperature, and the fire pit was driving the whole system. I added a circle of larger stones around the outside of the pit, creating a platform where I could set pots or reflect heat back toward the sleeping area. My grandfather had called this the living stone, the ring that stayed warm all night and could be used for cooking, drying clothes, or just holding your hands near when the cold got deep. The fire pit placement controlled everything. Set it too close to the door, and drafts would make it difficult to keep lit. Too far back, and the heat wouldn't reach the sleeping area. Dead center was the balance point, equidistant from all edges, positioned to heat the entire space evenly, located directly under the smoke hole so the draft would pull straight up. I realized, sitting there watching the fire, that the teepee wasn't a tent with a fire in it. It was a chimney with walls around it. The whole structure was designed to channel heat and smoke, to create a livable space within what was essentially a vertical furnace. The poles, the cover, the smoke flaps, the door position, everything was part of the same system, and the fire pit was the engine that made it work. I let the fire burn down to coals and banked it with ash, a technique my grandfather had taught me for keeping a fire alive overnight. The coals would smolder beneath the ash layer, staying hot enough to reignite with fresh wood in the morning. I'd add a log just before sleeping, and another when I woke, and the fire would never fully die as long as I tended it. That night, I slept on the north side of the teepee, opposite the door, in the spot that received the most reflected heat from the stones. I'd laid down a layer of pine boughs for insulation from the ground, then a canvas tarp, then my sleeping bag. The ground was cold, pulling heat away from anything touching it, but the pine boughs created an air gap that slowed the transfer. I woke twice during the night to add wood. Each time the coals were still glowing beneath the ash, and the new wood caught within seconds. The stones around the pit radiated heat I could feel from 3 feet away. The space inside the teepee was warm enough that my breath didn't fog, warm enough that I could move around without immediately losing body heat. The fire pit worked, the heat rose, the smoke vented, and the stones held warmth through the dark hours. For the first time since arriving in these mountains, I slept through a cold night without shivering. The temperature dropped to 20 degrees that night. I know because I'd hung a thermometer on one of the poles and I checked it before I banked the fire for sleep. 20 degrees outside. Inside, near the fire, it was close to 60. Near the walls, maybe 45. At the peak, probably colder. But the fact that there was a difference, that the tipi could be 40 degrees warmer than the air outside, meant the structure was working. It meant I might survive. I made mistakes that first night. The first was thinking I could sleep more than 2 hours without tending the fire. I woke to cold air pressing against my face and found the fire reduced to a handful of coals buried in ash. The stones were still warm, but barely. I added kindling, blew gently on the coals, and watched the smoke billow back into the teepee instead of rising toward the smoke hole. The air had gone still. The draft had stopped. I stumbled to the door in the dark and felt no wind outside, the perfect stillness. That comes on the coldest nights. Without wind to create pressure differences, the natural draft wasn't strong enough to pull smoke up and out. The smoke just sat there, filling the space, burning my eyes. I adjusted the smoke flaps, opening the eastern one wider to catch whatever air movement might exist. Nothing changed. The smoke continued to pool at chest height, turning the air gray. I coughed and crouched lower, where the air was clearer. My grandfather had talked about smoke management, about nights when the draft failed, but I'd never fully understood what he meant. I grabbed a piece of canvas and began fanning the air near the smoke hole, manually creating the updraft that should have happened naturally. It worked, sort of. The smoke began to move, curling up toward the peak, but as soon as I stopped fanning, it settled back down. I spent an hour figuring it out. The problem was that I'd let the fire get too low. The heat from the flames was what drove the draft, pulling. Cold air in through the base and pushing warm air out through the top. No heat, no draft. I built the fire back up, adding enough wood to create real flames, and watched the smoke pattern change. The heat pushed up, creating a column of rising air, and the smoke followed it. Within 10 minutes, the air inside cleared. The draft reestablished itself. The smoke rose cleanly through the hole, and I could breathe without coughing. Lesson learned. Never let the fire die down completely. Keep it hot enough to maintain draft. The second mistake was where I'd positioned my sleeping area. I'd set up on the north side, directly opposite the door, thinking it would be the warmest spot. And it was warm when I was lying down. But every time I sat up, my head entered the layer of hot air rising toward the peak, air that was too warm and carried the edge of smoke with it. I woke with a headache and a dry throat, signs that I'd been breathing smoke-tinged air all night. I moved my sleeping area to the northeast, offset from the direct line between the fire and the smoke hole. The air there was cooler but cleaner, and when I lay down, I was below the smoke layer entirely. The heat still reached me, reflected off the stones and the inner surface of the cover, but I wasn't directly in the column of rising air. The third mistake was assuming the teepee would be airtight. It wasn't, and it wasn't supposed to be. Cold air flowed in through the base of the cover where it met the ground. I'd staked it down tightly, but even so, air found its way through, under the stakes, through small gaps in the material, anywhere there was a path. At first, I thought this was a failure of construction. Then I realized it was the intake for the draft. The teepee needed fresh air entering at the bottom to replace the hot air leaving through the top. Seal it completely, and the fire would use up all the oxygen and go out. But the incoming air was cold. It poured across the floor like water, pooling in the low spots, and if I put my hand down at ground level, I could feel it moving. The solution was to raise the sleeping platform. I spent the next day gathering more pine boughs and building up a platform 6 inches off the ground. That 6 inches made an enormous difference. The cold air flowed underneath the platform instead of across it, and my sleeping area stayed noticeably warmer. I also learned that the fire needed constant attention. I'd thought I could load it with wood before sleeping and let it burn for hours, but that didn't work. Large logs burned too slowly and didn't create enough heat to maintain draft. Small wood burned too fast and needed constant replenishment. The balance was medium-sized pieces, 3 or 4 inches in diameter, added every 2 to 3 hours. By the third night, I'd established a rhythm. Build up the fire before sleeping. Wake once in the middle of the night to add wood. Wake again near dawn to add more. Each time I woke, I'd check the smoke. Pattern. Adjust the flaps if needed, and make sure the coals were still alive. It was exhausting, but it worked. The temperature inside the teepee stabilized. 40 degrees warmer than outside became normal. The stones stayed warm all night. The smoke vented cleanly. The air at sleeping level stayed breathable. I was no longer just occupying a structure. I was living in a system that required understanding and active management. My grandfather had said that living in a teepee wasn't like living in a house. A house was static. You built it, and it did its job without input. A teepee was dynamic. It required constant reading of conditions, constant small adjustments, constant awareness of how all the pieces worked together. I understood now. The teepee wasn't a shelter from winter. It was a partnership with winter, a negotiation between inside and outside, heat and cold, stillness and movement. You didn't defeat the cold, you learned to exist within it, to carve out a small space of warmth in the middle of freezing darkness. And every night you had to earn that warmth again. The storm gave 3 days' warning. The clouds built up in the west, gray and heavy, moving slowly toward the mountains. The wind shifted, coming from the southwest instead of the northwest, carrying moisture instead of dry cold. The air pressure dropped. I could feel it in my sinuses and see it in the way the smoke from the fire hung low instead of rising cleanly. I'd read about storms in books, studied weather patterns, learned to recognize the signs, but reading about a winter storm and living through one in a cedar bark teepee were different things. I spent those 3 days preparing. I gathered extra firewood, stacking it inside the teepee where it would stay dry. I checked every stake holding the cover down, driving them deeper, adding extra stakes where the fabric seemed stressed. I reinforced the smoke flap ties, making sure they wouldn't tear loose in high wind. I cleared snow from around the base of the teepee and built up a small berm of packed snow to block wind-driven precipitation from flowing underneath the cover. My grandfather had told me that the test of a teepee wasn't how it handled normal weather, it was how it handled the worst weather. The cone shape was designed to shed snow and deflect wind, but only if the structure was sound. A weak point in the frame or a tear in the cover could cascade into total failure. The storm arrived on the 4th day. It started with wind, gusts that made the cover snap and the poles creak. The wind circled the clearing, testing the teepee from every direction, finding the gaps in my preparation. The smoke flaps whipped back and forth, and I had to go outside twice to adjust the tie-downs and keep them from tearing. Then the snow came. Not the light, dry snow of early winter, but heavy, wet snow that stuck to everything it touched. It accumulated on the cover, adding weight, pulling down on the poles. I watched from inside as the cone shape began to sag, the cover bowing inward under the load. I'd read that a properly built teepee could handle snow loads because the steep angle of the cover caused snow to slide off, but that assumed dry snow and a smooth cover. This snow was wet, and the cedar bark panels created friction that held it in place. Within 2 hours, there were 6 inches of snow piled on the cover, and the weight was pulling the poles inward at the peak. I grabbed a long stick and went outside. The wind hit me like a physical force, driving snow into my face, making it hard to see. I worked my way around the teepee, pushing up on the cover from underneath with the stick, dislodging the accumulated snow. It slid down in sheets, piling up around the base. I pushed and cleared, working my way around the full circumference. My hands went numb, my face burned from the wind, but I kept pushing because I could see what would happen if I didn't. The poles would continue to bend inward, the cover would collapse, and I'd be trapped under a pile of snow-covered cedar, bark with no shelter at all. Inside I built up the fire, creating as much heat as possible. The heat rose and warmed the inner surface of the cover, melting the snow from underneath and making it slide off more easily. It worked, sort of. The snow still accumulated, but slower, and the melting created enough movement that I only had to go outside every hour instead of every 20 minutes. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days of wind that never stopped, snow that accumulated faster than I could clear it, temperatures that dropped into the single digits. I slept in short stretches, waking to add wood to the fire, checking the cover for new tiers, listening to the poles creak under the load. On the second night, one of the secondary poles cracked. I heard it snap, a sharp report that cut through the wind noise, and felt the cover sag on the south side. I grabbed my headlamp and climbed up the inside of the frame, finding the broken pole by touch. It had split lengthwise, weakened. By a knot I'd missed during preparation. I lashed a splint to it using a shorter pole and extra rope, binding the brake and redistributing the load. The repair was crude, but it held. The cover stopped sagging. The frame remained stable. By the third day, I was exhausted. I'd burned through a week's worth of firewood in 72 hours, slept maybe 10 hours total, and spent so much time outside in the storm that I'd stopped feeling my feet. But the teepee still stood. The cover was intact. The fire still burned. When the storm finally passed, I went outside to assess the damage. The clearing was buried under 3 feet of snow. Drifts had piled up against the north side of the teepee, reaching halfway up the cover. The trees around the clearing were bent under the weight of accumulated snow, and several branches had broken off and fallen nearby. But the teepee had held. The cone shape had shed most of the snow, just like it was designed to do. The poles were still straight, still leaning at the correct angle. The cover showed no tears, only a few places where the stitching had stretched but not broken. I walked around the outside, checking every stake, every tie-down, every point of stress. The structure had moved during the storm. I could see where the poles had shifted slightly, settling into new positions, but it had moved as a unit, flexing instead of breaking. Inside, I rebuilt the fire and sat watching the smoke rise through the hole in the peak. The sky above was clear and blue, the storm fully passed. The temperature was dropping again. Clear skies meant radiational cooling, but I knew the teepee could handle it now. It had survived the worst weather the mountains could throw at it. I'd survived because my grandfather's knowledge had survived, because people had built these structures for centuries, learning through trial and failure how to make them work, passing that knowledge down until it reached me. I hadn't invented anything. I just listened to what I'd been taught and trusted that the old ways worked because they had to work. That night I slept for 12 hours straight, only waking once to add wood. When I woke the next morning, the fire was still burning, the stones were still warm, and the teepee was still standing. I'd passed the test. Living in the teepee through the deep cold required rhythms, patterns that repeated daily, hourly, constantly. The structure wasn't a passive box that maintained warmth on its own. It was a system that demanded participation, attention, and understanding. The morning routine began before dawn. Wake to a fire reduced to coals, add kindling, blow gently until flames appeared, add larger wood once the kindling caught. Wait for the draft to reestablish as the heat built. While the fire grew, I'd adjust the smoke flaps to match the wind conditions, both open if the air was still, eastern flap only if the wind came from the west. Check the stones around the pit. If they'd gone cold overnight, the fire hadn't been tended properly. Breakfast was simple, usually cornmeal cooked in a pot, set on the stones, with dried meat if I had it. The cooking added moisture to the air, which was a problem. Moisture accumulated on the inside of the cover overnight, freezing into a layer of frost that would melt during the day and drip onto anything below. I learned to position my sleeping area and storage away from the drip line and to wipe down the cover each morning before the frost melted. After breakfast, I'd go outside to gather firewood. This was the most critical task. If I didn't maintain the wood pile, nothing else mattered. I'd cut standing dead wood, the kind that was dry enough to burn immediately, and drag it back to the clearing. I needed roughly 20 pieces per day, each about 3 inches in diameter and 2 feet long. That was enough to maintain a steady fire without overheating the space. I'd split the wood outside and stack it under a tarp lean-to I'd built on the east side of the tipi. The wood closest to the door would be the driest, so I rotated the stack, using the oldest wood first and adding new wood to the back. If I let the wood sit in the snow, it would absorb moisture and smoke instead of burning cleanly. Midday was for maintenance. Check the stakes. Holding the cover down, they worked loose over time as the ground froze and thawed. Inspect the cover for new tiers or wear points. Clear snow from around the base if it had accumulated overnight. Adjust the smoke flaps as the wind changed direction. The work was never finished. Something always needed attention. I also had to manage the fire pit itself. Ash accumulated at the bottom, reducing the space for coals and interfering with air circulation. Every 3 days, I'd let the fire burn down completely, remove the ash, and reset the stones if they'd shifted. The ash went outside, spread on the snow, where it would absorb sunlight and help with melting in spring. Afternoons were for food preparation and water. I'd melt snow in a pot. It took roughly 10 pots of packed snow to make 1 pot of water, and boil it to make sure it was safe. I'd cook whatever meal I'd planned, usually some combination of dried goods, rice, beans, and preserved meat. Fresh food was impossible. Anything fresh would freeze solid within hours. I learned to keep a pot of water near the fire at all times, adding snow to it periodically, so I'd always have drinking water available. Dehydration was a constant risk. The air inside the teepee was dry from the fire, and I'd lose moisture through breathing and sweating without noticing. Evening was when the real work began. As the sun set and the temperature dropped, the teepee's internal climate became more fragile. The fire had to be built up to compensate for the heat loss, but not so much that it created a smoke problem. The smoke flaps had to be adjusted for the evening wind patterns, which were different from the daytime patterns. The sleeping area had to be prepared, fresh pine boughs added to the platform, sleeping bag aired out and positioned away from the drip line. I'd bank the fire before sleeping, covering the coals with ash to slow the burn, adding 1 large log that would smolder for hours. Then I'd check the smoke one last time, making sure it was venting cleanly and settle in for the night. Sleep was never continuous. I'd wake every 2 to 3 hours, add wood, check the fire, adjust the smoke flaps if needed. If I slept too long, I'd wake to a cold teepee and a fire that had gone out. If I tended it too often, I'd burn through wood too quickly and exhaust myself. The routine became automatic. Wake, tend fire, gather wood, maintain structure, prepare food, manage water, bank fire, sleep, repeat. Every day, the same pattern. The routine wasn't boring, it was necessary. Each task built on the previous one, and skipping any of them meant paying for it later. I learned to read the smoke like a language. Smoke rising straight and fast meant good draft and plenty of heat. Smoke curling back down meant poor draft or insufficient heat. Smoke spreading out at chest level meant the air outside was perfectly still. Smoke tinted brown meant the wood was too wet. Smoke tinted white meant good dry wood burning cleanly. I learned to read the teepee's sounds. Poles creaking meant wind or temperature change. The cover snapping meant a gust had found it. A hissing sound meant snow melting off the outer surface. Silence meant either perfect calm or that I'd gone deaf from the cold, usually the latter. I learned to read my own body. Cold feet meant the fire was too low or the sleeping platform needed more insulation. Headache meant I'd been breathing too much smoke. Extreme thirst meant I hadn't been drinking enough water. Exhaustion meant I'd been tending the fire too often and needed to find a better balance. The tipi demanded attention every waking hour, but in return, it kept me alive. The exchange was fair. I gave it firewood, maintenance, and constant small adjustments. It gave me warmth, shelter, and the possibility of survival. My grandfather had lived this way for entire winters, decades of winters, and he'd done it while hunting, trapping, and providing for a family. I was doing it alone, with modern food and tools, and it was still the hardest thing I'd ever attempted. But I was learning. Every day the routine became smoother. Every night I woke fewer times. Every week I understood the system better. The teepee was teaching me, the way it had taught everyone who had ever lived in one, and the lessons came in the form of cold hands, smoke-filled eyes, and the simple fact of waking up alive every morning. The coldest night came in late January. I'd seen the signs building for days, the sky going clear and hard, the wind dying completely, the air taking on a quality that made sound travel differently. My grandfather had called this kind of cold the still cold, the kind that came when the atmosphere stopped moving and the Earth's heat simply radiated out into space until there was nothing left. The thermometer outside read -15 when the sun set. Inside the teepee, with the fire built high, it was 50 degrees. That was a 65-degree difference, maintained by nothing but cedar bark, canvas, and the knowledge of how to manage heat. I knew this night would test everything. Every stake had to hold, every pole had to stay straight, every piece of the cover had to remain intact, and I had to keep the fire burning perfectly, hot enough to maintain draft and create warmth, controlled enough to not burn through my entire woodpile before dawn. I'd prepared for a week, extra. Firewood stacked and split. Every stake double-checked and reinforced. The sleeping platform built up with fresh pine boughs. Extra blankets positioned near the fire to warm before I used them. Water melted and boiled in advance, so I wouldn't have to do it in the middle of the night. The temperature dropped 5 degrees every hour after sunset. By 10 p.m., it was -25 outside. Inside, it was 45 degrees near the fire, 35 degrees at the walls. I could see my breath if I moved more than 6 feet from the fire pit. I built the fire up and watched the smoke. It rose perfectly, pulled by the draft created by the difference between the hot air inside and the brutally cold air outside. The smoke flaps were both half closed to prevent heat loss while still allowing enough ventilation to maintain the draw. The balance was precarious, too open and heat would pour out. Too closed and smoke would accumulate. At midnight, the temperature outside reached -30. The teepee made sounds I'd never heard before, sharp cracks as the bark contracted, pops as moisture in the wood froze and expanded. The poles shifted slightly, settling into new positions as the cold pulled everything tighter. I lay in my sleeping bag and listened, trying to determine if the sounds were normal adjustment or structural failure. The fire burned steadily. I'd loaded it with the densest wood I had, oak I'd traded for in town weeks ago, and it burned hot and slow, creating the sustained heat the night demanded. The stones around the pit glowed dull red in the darkness, radiating warmth that I could feel from where I lay. I checked the fire every hour. Each time I woke, I added one piece of wood, adjusted the smoke flaps if needed, and checked the interior temperature by feel. By 3 a.m., it was -35 outside. Inside, it was holding at 40 degrees. My sleeping bag was warm. My breath was visible, but not freezing. My water bottle, kept inside the sleeping bag with me, was still liquid. At 4 a.m., I heard a sound that made me sit up immediately, a loud crack from somewhere in the frame. I grabbed my headlamp and climbed out of the sleeping bag, feeling the cold air hit me like a wall. I checked each pole by hand, looking for new splits or breaks. I found it on the northeast side. A secondary pole had developed a crack about 10 feet up, running 6 inches along the grain. The pole was still holding, but it was stressed. I lashed a splint to it using a shorter pole and rope, working quickly because my hands were going numb. The repair took 10 minutes, and by the time I finished, I couldn't feel my fingers. I climbed back into the sleeping bag and spent 20 minutes warming my hands against my stomach before I could sleep again. At dawn, the temperature outside was -38. The thermometer couldn't read any colder. It maxed out at -40. Inside the teepee, the fire still burned. The stones still radiated heat. The smoke still vented cleanly. The temperature inside was 38 degrees, exactly 76 degrees warmer than the air outside. I'd made it through the coldest night of winter in a structure made of bark, canvas, and poles. The teepee had held. The system had worked. Everything my grandfather had taught me, everything the old ones had learned over centuries of winters, had proven true one more time. I climbed out of the sleeping bag and added wood to the fire, building it up as the sun rose. Outside, the world was locked in cold so deep that the snow had turned to powder, so dry it squeaked when you walked on it. The trees were frosted white, and the air was so clear you could see individual peaks 50 miles away. I stood outside the teepee and looked at it from a distance. The cone stood solid against the white landscape, smoke rising straight from the peak, the cedar bark panels weathered to the exact color of the forest floor. It looked like it belonged there, like it had always been there. My grandfather had told me once that the teepee wasn't something you built and then lived in. It was something you built and then learned from. Every night taught you something about heat, about air, about the relationship between inside and outside. Every storm tested you. Every cold night proved whether you'd been paying attention. I'd been paying attention. I'd listened to what he'd taught me, trusted the knowledge that had been passed down, and done the work required to make it real. The teepee had kept me alive not because it was a perfect structure, but because I'd learned how to live in partnership with it. The validation wasn't that I'd survived the coldest night. It was that I understood why I'd survived, because the teepee was a system, and I'd learned to be part of that system. The fire, the stones, the smoke flaps, the draft, the cover, the poles, they all worked together, and my job was to read them, adjust them, and keep them balanced. I walked back inside and sat by the fire, feeling the warmth, watching the smoke rise. Outside, the temperature would stay below zero for another week. But inside, the teepee would maintain its small pocket of warmth hour by hour, night by night, as long as I kept tending it. My grandfather had survived 83 winters in structures like this. I'd survived one night. But I understood now what he'd meant when he said that the teepee wasn't shelter from the winter. It was shelter within the winter. You didn't escape the cold. You learned to exist alongside it, to carve out a space where life was possible in the middle of impossible cold. And every morning, you earned that space again.